All right. Welcome back, everybody, to the next week on this podcast, Sinai to Salt Lake. As always, I'm joined by our esteemed co-host, Shabbos Kestenbaum. This week, we are talking all about Abraham and covenants. We're going to cover Genesis chapters 12 through 17, as well as Abraham chapters 1 through 2. So I'll let you take the floor, Shabbos. If there's anything that stands out to you, I don't know if you had time to read Abraham, or if you just want to tell us what you know and what you love about Genesis, go right ahead.
Okay, sure. Well, it's good to see you and good to be back. We were just discussing before we went live that I've been traveling the last 10 or so days, including, of course, to Israel. And without getting into the politics of it, I was discussing, and I know this is not entirely related to Genesis, although it might be at the end, so stay tuned, whether one has a particular aversion or feeling towards the state of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, the orchestration of the war in Gaza. It is incredibly important that for someone who calls himself a Mormon or a Christian, a Jew, that they go to where the Bible happened, that they go to Capernaum and they go to Nazareth and they go to Bethlehem and they go to Mount Megiddo and they see where these things occurred and they connect in the footsteps of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jesus. And I can't for the life of me understand why, I guess I will be a little political, why someone like Tucker Carlson, whose podcasts the last 6 months have all been about the alleged mistreatment of Christians in Israel, yet he lands in Israel. He's a 30-minute drive away from all of those places I just mentioned, and he refuses to leave the airport. So again, you can hate the state of Israel and hate Bibi and hate all that stuff, but I just don't get this contemporary aversion that way too many Christians, predominantly those who are addicted to online narratives, have against connecting to the land of the Bible. And the reason I say this might actually relate to Genesis is because, of course, we have in our discussion today God commanding Abram, Lech lecha ma'artzecha umi moladecha. You should go from the place of your birth and you should journey. And this sort of becomes the beginning of the story of the Jewish people. Of course, Genesis 12:3 amongst Christian Zionists continues to play an important role in their theological understanding of Israel, where God says to Avram, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. But essentially, we see this incredibly powerful conversation that God has between Avram, where he tells you, go forth from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. So the Genesis, no pun intended, the Genesis of the Jewish people begins here, begins in chapter 12. There's actually a discussion in the rabbinic commentators, Ramban, as to how literally the Hebrew Bible should be taken up until this point, as in the creation of the world all the way until the end of Genesis chapter 11. Is this an allegory? Is this an analogy? Was there a literal talking snake? Was there a literal flood? And it's debated. I mean, the overwhelming consensus is certainly the story of Noah and the flood very much did happen. The story of Adam and Eve, I would say the majority would still say it happened, but there are differing interpretations as to how literally we meant to be taking it. But certainly Genesis chapter 12, this is where we kick into high gear. And so as my teacher used to say in math class, if you weren't paying attention now, if you weren't paying attention until now, then start paying attention. So this is kind of the crux of the story of the Jewish people. And by the way, it's just interesting, and I know I'm going on a tangent before we even really began the conversation, but there's a question that Rashi, the most famous rabbinic commentator, has when he says, why did the Bible start with Genesis? I mean, why not just start with the story of the Jewish people? Why not start when God is giving us the commandments? Because there's not much in terms of laws and rituals and practices that you can practically receive from the story of Adam and Eve, from the story of Noah, even the story of Abraham until he actually gets into the land. So Rashi wants to know, why don't we just start the story in like Exodus? And Rashi says it's to come to teach us that God is the creator of the world, and God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. Rashi is writing this almost 1,000 years ago, when there was no conception of political Zionism that Jews would actually be able to live in the land of Israel en masse as they once did. Of course, Jews had been living in the land of Israel uninterrupted for the last 3,000 years, but never in large numbers from our expulsion. And Rashi says the reason we start with these stories is to teach teach us that there's a creator, there's a organizer of the world, and he has ordained it that this particular land belongs to a particular group of people, which is a pretty remarkable thing for someone to be saying more than 1,000 years ago. But I digress. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, and I'm sorry if I kind of went on a tangent, but that's kind of what's on my mind today. It's increasingly difficult to separate the contemporary political crises with how I'm reading the Hebrew Bible.
No, I think that's great. I don't see how you could easily separate the two with everything that's going on in current events, all of everything that's happening to you, everything that people are saying to you, that people are saying online is because of your religion, which is thousands and thousands of years old. So of course it's all going to tie in. Your tangents are the whole reason we wanted you to come on this show. You know, you are what makes this content. So don't ever apologize for the tangents.
Get that?
But no, I think that's great. Um, we love Abraham. You know, as we've explained a couple times, we have the book of Abraham that we read personally that gives a little more detail. Luckily, this week, a lot of it is very similar. Anybody from our audience who's LDS, who's been reading along with the Come Follow Me curriculum, I'm sure you've all noticed Abraham chapters 1 and 2, and you can draw whatever parallels you like with Genesis 12 through 17. But while we have you, Shabbos, really, we just want to hear from you. I had a couple questions. I'd like to talk about Melchizedek. I'd like to know, what you have learned about him, because not a whole lot is said in the Old Testament, but we sure have opinions about him, and I know that there's a lot of rabbinic opinion about Melchizedek as well.
Yeah, so it's sort of similar to what we discussed last week, which is you might be disappointed in my answer. So the Jewish conception on Melchizedek is somewhat simplistic. Melchizedek is not spoken about in the Hebrew Bible in terms of his genealogy, but in the Gemara, in the Talmud, particularly Maseches Nedarim, 32b, might be 36b, so someone can fact check me. It goes into his genealogy just a little bit, and the rabbinic tradition is that Melchizedek is actually the son of Noach. He is Shem. He is the firstborn son of Noach, and there's actually this interesting anecdote, again, that the Gemara goes into, which I'll actually just read for you. I don't typically prepare for these things, but I wanted to make sure I got the Gemara right, so I prepared the Gemara, and it says as follows. This is, Nedarim 32b. I'll just read the Hebrew and translate. Amar Rabbi Zechariah Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Zechariah said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, Bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God wanted Lehotzi Kahuna Mishem. God wanted the priesthood, the Kahuna, to come from Shem, to come from Noach's firstborn son, so that his kids would be priests as well. How do we know this? Shene Emar, as the pasuk says, and this pasuk is Hebrew for the word verse. This verse comes from Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, and it says, "V'hu Kohen La'el Elyon," and he, referring to Melchizedek, was the God of the Most High. This is Melchizedek approaching Avram, and he's bringing forth bread and wine. However, Kavan, Shehektim Birkas Avraham, Libirkas Hamakom. However, once Melchizedek, who again is typically identified as Shem, when he placed the blessing of Avraham before the blessing of God, Hotzi me'Avraham, then the priesthood emerged not from Melchizedek, but it now emerged from Avraham. And now the descendants of the priesthood would no longer be from the descendants of Shem or Melchizedek, it would now be from the descendants of Avraham. So we learn, this is all according to the Gemara from the Talmud, we learn that Melchizedek was actually punished because when he gives this blessing, he first blesses man, Avraham, and only then does he bless God. And he was wrong to have done that. And therefore, his punishment is that the priesthood no longer comes from Melchizedek anymore, but it comes from Avraham. And I think we spoke about this last time, but it is interesting to think about why is it that Avraham is the patriarch of Judaism. We say in Shemona Esrei, which are, we pray thrice a day, and the Shemona Esrei is an 18 blessing prayer. Technically it's actually 19, but that's a story for another time as to how we got that 19th blessing. That came a little later. And when we begin the Shemona Esrei prayer, we say, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu v'Elokeinu, blessed are you God, the God of our forefathers, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And before we mention our needs and desires and wants, we first hearken back to the fact that God, you are the God of our forefather Abraham. So why was Abraham our patriarch? Because you have Melchizedek, you have Adam, you have Noah. Why was it that Avraham was selected? And there are a bunch of different reasons, and that's my cat, so say hi to Edwin. But one of the reasons is what we just saw here, is that Avraham recognized that you give thanks to God first. And in fact, just one last tangent, the Gemara in I think it's Masechet Sota, but again, I have to be fact-checked on that. But a different tractate of the Talmud, it talks about that Avraham had this open tent, which is a tradition in the Mormon faith, and the Christian faith, and in the Jewish faith, that he welcomed in the stranger. Now, the Gemara takes it a step further. And after he had welcomed in the strangers, and they were satiated, they had what to eat, had what to drink, the strangers would tell Avraham, how can we possibly thank you? What can we do to show our appreciation? And Avraham was always caught off guard. And he says, don't thank me, thank the Creator. Thank the one who gave us this opportunity. And so one of the reasons why Avraham became the patriarch, the founder of Judaism, is because he was the first one to go out into the world and tell mortal man, don't thank me, another mortal man, but thank the Most High, thank God who has provided all of our physical needs as well. And that's something that Melchizedek was not able to appreciate.
Perfect. Sorry, my phone just went flying out of my little stand, so we're going to take a little tangent. By the way, your cat is one of the cutest cats I've ever seen in my life.
Yes, no, he's great.
So
We're very proud of Edwin.
he is so cute. I see him on your social media stories all the time. I always want more Edwin content. Thank you. No, that's really great. I don't know how familiar you are specifically with some of the orders of our church, of our ecclesiastical auxiliary functions, but men in the church are called to the office of priesthood. When they're 12, they can be ordained to what we refer to as the Aaronic priesthood. And when you're 18 and older, especially if you're preparing to go on a mission, or even if you're not going on a mission and you're going through the temple, is kind of how we say it when you're taking out your endowments, you are also called to the office of Melchizedek priesthood. I'm not a priesthood holder for obvious reasons, and my poor dad isn't able to make it this week. But next time he's here, I'm going to ask him to share really briefly with you, if you're interested, and for anybody in our audience who's Jewish or who's not affiliated with either religion, we'll have my dad talk about it a little bit and explain. But we were in Israel last fall. My dad and I were there with a group of LDS podcasters and influencers, and we saw what they've uncovered so far of the ruins of the temple of Melchizedek. And that was really fabulous. It was very interesting. A lot of the process of the anointing and the cleaning for the priests in the temple of Melchizedek are really, really remarkably similar to the process that you go through when you go through the temple to take out your endowments. So, as always, as we do every week on this podcast, as I do every time I study pretty much anything Judaic, I'm learning just what similarities there are between Judaism and the LDS tradition. And it's almost always the things which set us apart from the other Christian sects that we just so happen to have in common with the Jewish tradition. And I'm really loving that. I'm really loving that we're discovering so much of that in this series.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. You're actually reminding me of something, and I don't know the proper terminology, so you're going to have to educate me on this. But is the Melchizedek, I don't know how to say this in a politically correct term. So in a non-politically correct term, the secret Mormon handshake, which I know is not a great way of describing it, but in the temple services, there are certain signs that you present upon your ascendance to the heaven. Is that what the Melchizedek handshake is, or am I making this up?
It's part of it. You're understanding correctly. We do signs, and I'm not going to say the other word that we use. It's always hard to know just how specific we can be without being disrespectful to the sanctity of the temple. But yes, the Melchizedek priesthood and what we know from Melchizedek himself plays a very, very vital role in what we call the endowment session in the temple. You go through the initiatory process, which is where they do the washing and the anointing. And actually, I don't know, Cardin Ellis with Ward Radio has a podcast episode coming out soon where they talk about the anointing of David in the new children's movie that just came out from Angel Studios. You should watch that. You'll get a good idea of what the initiatory process looks like in the temples for us. And then after that, you go through the endowment process, which is where the secret Mormon handshakes and everything
Yes,
take place.
I knew there was a theologically professional term. I just didn't know what it was, so I apologize for the rudimentary way in which I described it. But thank you for educating me on that. And I guess I would also add, as it pertains, just going back to Malchit Tzedek, that Malchit Tzedek in Hebrew is derived from two distinct words, which is Malke, king, and Tzedek, righteousness. So literally, Malchit Tzedek was the king of righteousness, which reflects not only his rule, but also where he ruled. So he ruled in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is also a compilation of two separate words of Yeru, or really Yerah, and Shalem. Shalem in this case referring to peace. So Jerusalem is known for its righteousness and it's known for its peace, at least in the Bible. Today it's quite complicated. And then I think you asked me this, or you texted me beforehand, why do we have this story now? And it's kind of a good question, because Genesis chapter 14 is talking about the king of Sodom. We're talking about the approach of Abraham and his journey in Egypt, and how he has to take actually great lengths to hide his wife Sarah from Paro. And there's one explanation offered by the Rashbam. The Rashbam is the grandson of another famous rabbinic commentator, but he's a rabbinic sage in his own right. And he says, well, it's really a very practical matter. There's a practical reason why we have the story of Malchit Tzedek now, because Abraham is telling the king of Sodom, in Genesis chapter 14, that protect me and I won't even take a thread or a sandal strap. And then in order to sort of validate the fact that Avraham did not and would not benefit from the spoils of war, we have the story of Avraham and Malchit Tzedek, where it kind of shows that Avraham was only sustained by bread and wine. He wasn't sustaining himself, nor did he need the spoils of war. So the introduction of Malchit Tzedek, which is sort of like this random insertion in an otherwise coherent narrative, is really just to validate Avraham's letter to the king of Sodom, saying, I'm not going to partake in the spoils of war, because look, when I was with this king Malchit Tzedek, all I took was bread and wine that he gave me. And then the last point, this comes from one of the Hasidic masters, from I think it's from Rabbi Menachem, the Tzemach Tzedek, one of the Chabad Rebbeim, and he says that the phrase is of bread is hotzi, is to brought out. And this is referring to the fact that there was spiritual dissemination, that Abraham was bringing out Torah into the world. So according to the Hasidic masters, or at least this one particular Hasidic master in the Chabad tradition, the bread represents the revealed aspects of the Torah, of Abraham taking out the spirituality that was once confined into the most innermost dimensions, and he's bringing it out into the wider world. And I think that's also validated by what we were just saying earlier in the Gemara, in the tractate Nedarim, whereby Abraham would always tell man, be thinking of and be thankful of God. Don't simply think that I'm the one who brought you sustainment, I'm the one who brought you bread or wine. No, there was a higher power, and it's a higher power that you must show appreciation for.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah, thank you. I don't really have much to add to that. So, sorry, we're a little stilted. For those of you watching, it's a little later at night than we usually film, so I apologize for being a little off balance. But I want to move on, if that's okay, unless you have anything else that you want to add.
Happy to move on.
In chapter, was it 16, 17? In chapter 17, verse 7, Abraham is conversing with God, and this is where you finally read, I will bless thee and thy seed forever. And it's not until several verses later that we then get the qualifier, I will bless the line of Isaac, and he promises all these blessings to Ishmael, his son, but he promises the land and he promises the covenant to Isaac. And for our LDS audience especially, I really want to drive home that point. Like you're always saying, not to get too political, but we're going to get a little political here, because I think it's really important that we understand this. as Christians, as members of the LDS Church, as a representative of the Jewish people of the Zionist vision, uh, let's just talk about that for a bit. If there's anything you want to add to that, if there's anything that you want to stress about that point, go right ahead.
Well, yeah, this is sort of where Islam and Judaism begin to diverge. Islam will look at Yishmael as their prophet, whereas, of course, Judaism not only takes a more negative approach to Yishmael, but will then just say Yishmael is not the prophet, it's Yitzchak. And the lineage, to your point, if you look at verse 7, it's quite clear that the lineage, the Abrahamic priesthood, let's say, it is continuing, but it's continuing through Yitzchak, Isaac, and then through his son, Yaakov, Jacob, then through his son, Yosef, and his 11 brothers. So that's where Islam and Judaism first begin to diverge. Another point, I know you didn't address this specifically, but I think it's an important theological point to make. There are a lot of narratives, especially online now, about Amalek and what Amalek means today, certainly in the context of Israel-Palestine. This is an entirely different theological debate, but suffice to say that both Chronicles 2, Divrei Hayamim, as well as the Gemara itself, is quite clear that Amalek as a people doesn't really exist anymore, nor is there a command to actually kill this people. The least of which is because we don't know who they are. Also because they don't exist as a qualifying people. It also doesn't mean to kill. It just means having them to stop and be Amalek, meaning you can convert them into a different religion. But I digress. The reason I'm bringing this up is because Amalek traces its lineage back to Yishmael. And Yishmael and Hagar, of course, are kicked out of Abraham's home. Sarah is concerned that Yishmael is a bad influence on her son, Yitzchak, and she's right to think that. And so they're banished. To make a long story short, they're in the desert, they're hungry, they're tired, and they're wasting away. And Hagar, who is a fascinating figure, I say fascinating, a bit of a negative connotation, because she essentially abandons her son in a very selfish manner, not wanting to see him die. She essentially leaves him, and Yishmael calls out to heaven. And now I'm going a bit midrashically, or the rabbinic exposition, but essentially there's this debate, this heavenly debate, and the angels go to God. Again, how literally do we take this? Not very, but it's really to draw out a theological principle. The angels go to God and say, well, hang on, God, you know who the descendants of Yishmael will be. You know the type of strife and pain and oppression and persecution that his kids and his kids' kids will bring upon the Jewish people. Why save him? He's calling out to you to be saved. Simply say no. Cause him to melt away in the desert sun, and you'll never have to hear from him nor his descendants again. And the theological principle we learn from this is God does not, in fact, judge the father for the sins of his son, nor the son for the sins of his father, but God judges us based on who we are as the individual at that particular moment in time. In fact, the rabbis take it even a step further. And if I were to ask God for forgiveness, if I was repenting and I say, God, I apologize because I have this temptation to eat a cheeseburger. Every time I go to work, I pass the McDonald's on the side of the road, and I just have this overwhelming physical desire to partake in it. And I did it, and I'm so sorry, but it won't happen again. God knows that even though 3 days later you will be partaking in McDonald's again and you'll be asking for the same forgiveness, at this particular moment in time, because you really are sorry, because you really are pained by your sin, God does not judge your future actions. Nor does God really judge your actions in the past. God judges who you are based in this particular moment in time. And that's why I mentioned that Tzemach Tzedek, this Rabbi Menachem Mendel of the Chabad movement, and in Chabad, the seventh and last Rebbe, also named Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who actually President Trump went to the grave of on October 7th. I went with him, which is pretty cool. But anyways, he was once asked by a Jew, and he said, I want to be a follower of yours. So what do I need to do? Is there a special garb? Is there a special robe? Are there certain prayers I should say? Or is there special foods I should be eating? What can I do to be a follower of you, O holy rabbi? And Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson writes back in this letter, and he says it's very simple. I don't want you wearing special clothing, and I don't want you eating special food, and I don't want you saying special prayers. I want you to wake up each day and say, I want to be better today than I was yesterday. And if you do that, then you're a follower of mine. And I think we first learn that important theological principle, ironically, based on Yishmael. And again, Yishmael is not a particularly heroic figure. He's not a very redeemable biblical character, but nevertheless, we see through Yishmael the overwhelming sense of compassion and love and mercy that God has onto his children, even though he knows, even though God knows that Yishmael later in life and his descendants will be acting in the against the interests of God. Nevertheless, that's not how God looks and judges us, which is a really, I think, comforting and remarkable aspect of God. This is someone who sees us at this particular moment in time, not on the future or hypothetical sins we may commit in the future.
Hmm.
I also, sorry, let me just add one last thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, because this is also something I find really remarkable. We mentioned earlier, and the Gemara, the Talmud goes to lengths to talk about how how Abraham was able to bring so many people close to God, right? Strangers would come to his tents, and Abraham would get these strangers to thank God, to recognize that there's a higher deity. In Hebrew, or in modern Hebrew at least, it's called being makarev. It's karov in modern Hebrew means to come close. So being makarev is causing others to come closer to God, to recognizing their relationship with the divine. And so the question I always had as a young pseudo intellectual was, hang on a second, if Abraham can bring thousands of strangers, people he does not know, closer to God, then how come when it comes to his own son, Yishmael, he's not able to do the same thing? And in fact, he has to cast his own son out of the house. How does this make any sense? Well, he's such a remarkable figure when it comes to total strangers, but he's a lousy dad, and he has to kick him out. What's this discrepancy? And I think this can probably, I don't actually know if I don't know if rabbis believe in this, but this is just my own personal answer, which is Yishmael is described by Rashi, one of the most famous rabbinic commentators that I think I mentioned earlier. He's described as an ish mitzachek, which literally ish means a man or person, and mitzachek kind of means mocking or laughter. So when Abraham would go to his two kids, Yitzchak and Yishmael, and he would say, this is the truth. This is the tree of life. This is the knowledge I want to impart on you. So Yitzchak was interested in it. He wanted to grow and learn. And Yishmael, when he was, brought a Bible, when he was brought a series of teachings, his apathy, his attitude of disregard was so overwhelming that not even his own father, Abraham, was able to sort of change his mentality. And I think from this, we actually learn another important lesson, which is, and we sort of mentioned this when it comes to evil and righteousness. If someone has beliefs that we think are wrong, those beliefs, that convictions that they have, they can be channeled into the right beliefs, right? As we said last time, if someone is evil, that passion can be transformed and evolved into righteousness, into goodness, right? As long as one's vessel is full, even if it's full with a poison, there's what to work with. There's what that can be changed. Yet when someone's vessel is empty, when someone is apathetic towards not just religion, but towards the world at large, towards their relationship with God, it's very difficult to try to evolve or to transform because there's nothing there to transform to begin with. I think one of the most destructive tendencies, let's say in our American political culture today, and this is indicative of religion as well, it's not if someone's believing in the wrong God or someone's performing the wrong commandments, it's just young people not caring. It's that sense of apathy that this just doesn't matter to me. I'm an ish mitzachek. I just mock this because it means nothing. And I think from this, I'm going to say a very silly line that is quite elementary and quite juvenile. But better to believe in the wrong God than to believe in no God. Believe in something, because even if that belief is something that we detest, at least that passion, as I said, can be converted. At least we can try to reform. But when someone believes in nothing, it's very, very difficult to convince them of anything. And I believe, just from a familial dynamic, that's why Avraham was not able to reach and to impart any wisdom when it came to his own son, because his son was just apathetic.
I think that's a really A really interesting observation. I think that's a really good point. Thank you. Um, totally worth keeping going. Never apologize for going on longer. Everything you say is something that we really just drink up. So we're pleased to hear from you. Let's talk about it a little bit more, though. This is not the first instance, but this is one of the early instances of seeing God make a covenant with somebody, with some figure in the Bible. He makes a covenant with Abraham, and he's essentially prematurely, proactively, I guess you could say, making a covenant with Isaac and later with Jacob and Joseph and their descendants and with the children of Israel, and so kind of the theme this week for the Come Follow Me curriculum is covenants. I'm going to give a little spoiler alert. We're going to be doing a special episode tomorrow with another special guest just talking about the concept of covenants and what they mean. But one thing that's really interesting that God says is he's making an everlasting covenant with Abraham, and I think my personal observation is the Jewish people have taken that very, very literally. And you have kept your end of the deal. I see Jewish people every day. I live on the East Coast now, I'm in the Northeast. At my old job, 90% of the people I saw every single day at work were Jewish, and you could tell from across the room, you knew that they were, and they were just in a very lovely way, I mean that in the kindest way possible. Um, so talk to me a little bit. Tell me about the everlasting covenants. Tell me what you think, what you feel about covenants as a whole, what you think about that specific wording.
Sure. So, I mean, it'd be helpful if I'll read it in Hebrew just very briefly, one of the verses that manifests in a very physical way this everlasting covenant. And I think that's probably the most important word, not the covenant part, but the everlasting part. So let's look
Mm-hmm.
at verse 9, for example. Vayomer Elohim el Avraham, God speaking to Abraham, and he says, Va'ata es brisi tishmor. Ata vizarecha acharecha ledorosam. You will keep my covenant, referring to Abraham, you and your descendants and their descendants throughout their generations. And one of the ways that we physically remember that covenant, not because we took it upon ourselves to do it, but because God specifically tells us to do it in verse 11. He says, Unimaltem es basar arlaschem. That you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it should be a sign of the covenant between me and you. And it is remarkable that the Jewish people, for 3,000 years, have been performing the exact same ritual on every single Jewish man throughout eternity. And there's actually a story in the Talmud of King David was once feeling despondent. I don't actually remember the exact details, so again, someone has to fact check me. But he felt that he was committing sin. He felt that he just wasn't doing God's will. He felt that he wasn't performing as best as he could. And the Talmud essentially says, and then David, who was in the bathhouse at the time, he looked down and he saw this physical reminder of the covenant that his forefather Abraham took and that he is a living testament of. And it's quite remarkable that every Jewish man bears a physical mark that personifies and represents the covenant that God is telling Abraham more than 3,000 years ago. So, Judaism is often, or Jews are often described as the people of the book, and that's certainly true because the book has sustained us for, 3,000 years plus. But a book typically is something you read and then you put it down, and maybe it'll impact you and it'll give you a couple of interesting ideas, but then life goes on. We're not just a people of the book and then you put it down, but the book tells us to do things. We create our lives, we create communities, we create families, we create people out of what is in this book. And that's why a bris milah, literally circumcision, is a hallmark of the Jewish faith. And we can talk about stories that I've heard of in the Holocaust of mothers who knew that their babies were destined to the gas chambers or destined, to a mass grave, and in their last fleeting moments, would, take out anything, a knife, anything they had to create this circumcision for their child, to show that even in their last moments in life, they are part of this eternal covenant. The concept of a Jewish person or the Jewish nation not continuing this tradition would be unthinkable. This is something that I said has connected Jews for more than three millennia.
Hmm. That's incredible. I'd never heard that about, the victims of the Holocaust. It hadn't even occurred to me to think about that. I know that that happened. I know that there were children. I know that there were infants there, but I guess it just goes to show I'm not Jewish. I never have stopped to think, what about circumcision?
Yeah,
What about this and that?
and in
I
fact, oh,
always,
sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
I just, I know that people in such dire, such horrific circumstances, you do what you can to keep your covenants. And I believe in a God who understands that there's only so much you can do when you're in, a concentration camp. But I I couldn't have imagined people would be thinking about that either. These mothers of these young babies. That is just such a commitment, such a centrality to the gospel that to the gospel that you believe. I think that's incredible.
Yeah, and this I think is fortified in verse 14, where God not only first we have God in verse 10 talking about the importance of the circumcision, and then in verse 14 to sort of underscore it, he says, "V'arel zachar." A man, asher lo yimal es basar arlaso, v'nechrata, a man who does not take part in this covenant. V'hanefesh ahu me'ameha es brisi hefar, that he's cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So I think not I think God Himself is underscoring what a fundamentally critical command that this is. And in fact, it's only after, I'm just thinking out loud, but it's only after God gives this command, only then, once the covenant has been established, so to say, that then God now tells Abraham, your wife Sarai is now Sarah, and that you will have a child. And Abraham, he falls on his face and he says, I'm 100, Sarah's 90, we're going to have a child. And God says, yes, I'm one who performs miracles. I'm one who upends nature. So being part of this covenant, it's not merely that it's a one-way street, but no, this is a relationship. As with any relationship, there's giving and there's taking. And that's normal and healthy, and that's what's expected in a relationship. And God is showing in this relationship that I will not only be blessing you, Avraham, but I will be creating a great nation from you. So once he establishes the importance of the covenant, once he establishes the importance of the circumcision, now he goes on to say, and you will have, this child, and from this child will be Yaakov, and from Yaakov, so on and so forth.
Hmm. Here's the question that I have about this that I forgot until I just went back and checked my notes. As this covenant is happening, as he's having this conversation with God, why the change in name? What is that about? Is there something that I'm missing because I'm reading this in English, or because I don't have access to the rabbinic studies? What happened there? Why did they have to change their names?
So Avraham his name was already changed by this point. Sarai turning into Sarah, that is a good question. I would have to learn that. I don't know.
Okay, that's no problem. We'll circle back to that. We'll come back to that
I
because
if I think, and again, someone would have to fact check me. Um, Sarai to Sarah. Sarai is sort of I don't know if it's possessive, but it means like Sarai, meaning onto oneself, whereas it means Sar is a prince. Like in modern day Hebrew, a Sar is a prince. So Sarai would sort of be like my prince, or she's a woman, so it'd be my princess. Whereas Sarah is not possessive or exclusive; it's more universal. So I would imagine God is telling Abraham, call her Sarah, because it's now no longer internal or possessive, but she will be sort of a princess to a broader people, and that is the Jewish people. But I would imagine it's deeper than that. So I would have to learn that and ask some rabbis. I don't know.
okay. Well, we'll ask around. We'll see. Do you have any? Is it kind of that same situation with Abraham's name change, or do you know why he changed his name at all?
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing. Avram to Avraham is
Mhm.
going from singular to multitude. He's basically just giving one extra letter, which in Hebrew it's the hey. And my understanding, and I'm happy to be fact checked on this, but the hey is kind of representative of God Himself. So he's now a father of a godly nation, and I think that's what the hey, not Hey, but the Hebrew letter. I think that's what the hey is
Mhm.
to signify that he's now part of a or the leader of a nation. So, but again,
Oh,
I would have to do a deeper dive on that one.
that's all right. I decided earlier today that I'm not going to be afraid of saying something wrong because we'll just count that as rage bait and that'll just get us more traction in the comments. It's like my dad always says, there is no impulse stronger among human beings than correcting someone else's work.
Right. I mean,
So,
God has, a personal name, the Tetragrammaton, I think that's what it's called, and and the hay is part of it. So my understanding, and again, the audience can yell at me, but my understanding is God was giving part of the Tetragrammaton, part of the godly name, to Avram, now Avraham, to signify that you are going to be the father, the patriarch of this nation that I have just told you about. So that's why he's signifying the name change. Also, I should be clear because I don't think I was when in chapter 14 when God is telling Abraham. Excuse me, chapter 17. He's I believe he's referring to Yishmael. I don't think he's referring to Yitzchak because the three angels when they visit Avraham, that's when they tell about Yitzchak. I think this part is Yishmael.
gotcha. Thank you. So, again, our theme this week is covenants, and I
Sorry,
want to
that's
keep
not true.
talking about
No, sorry,
this.
I'm going to fact check myself as
Oh,
well.
no, go ahead. Yeah.
Now I'm reading the psukim, I'm reading the verses, and that's not true either. Vayomer Elohim aval Sara ishtecha yaldas lecha ben vikrata et shemo Yitzchak v'akimosi esprisi ito levreta olam lezar acharav. He's very much referring to Isaac, so ignore what I just said.
Okay. That's fine. This is good. We're all learning together. That's the whole point. But yeah. So I really want to keep talking about this theme. I really want to keep talking about covenants because I think maybe I'm wrong. I didn't study world religions. I'm not a Harvard Divinity grad like some of us here. But to my understanding, most other religions today, especially within the Abrahamic faiths, don't do quite as much with the concept of covenants as the Jews and as the LDS community. We consider a lot of our actions covenants, and we talk about the covenant path all the time. That's very common terminology, I guess you could say, among Latter-day Saints. What are some things that you do, that are a continuation of your covenants? How do you, again, we call it keeping our covenants. How do you keep your covenants in the Jewish tradition? What do you do on a daily basis, on a weekly basis?
Well, almost the entirety of our daily ritual life is based upon what comes from the Torah. So again, Torah just means Hebrew Bible. So the covenant is fulfilled when Jews fulfill the covenant, which sounds a little
Mm-hmm.
circular, but it's kind of true. So when God says on the eighth day, I mean, he literally says this in chapter 17, on the eighth day you will circumcise your son. And then, in fact, actually, this happens to be true, but in my synagogue here in Los Angeles, there's a circumcision tomorrow. That's a fairly typical thing because we have lots of babies, and anytime there's
Mm-hmm.
a baby boy, 8 days later, he will be circumcised. So that is not something that we do in a vacuum. That's something that we're doing to connect to this 3,000-year-old covenant. When we pray, which again we do it 3 times a day, we hearken back to God. You are the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When we put on the phylacteries, which are these leather black leather stripes, I guess. That is in direct fulfillment of the book of Deuteronomy, saying that this should be an everlasting sign, "Vayula tetefos beinenecha," between your eyes, "Ukshartem laos al yadecha," and also, on your hand. So much, if not all, of the Jewish ritual life is based upon things that God is actively telling us to do. Which, again, even if you're not Jewish, I think it only strengthens one's own Christianity or one's own religion when they recognize that this is a people, that they're referring to the Jewish people, who are small in number, but have nevertheless kept the rituals, kept the commands, and kept a covenant, even though they had been dispersed, even though they had been persecuted, even though they had been small in number. That is a remarkable testament to the fact that when God gives a covenant, and this is where I sort of don't quite understand supersessionism or replacement theology, my God is not a promise breaker. My God is a promise keeper. My God does not forsake covenants. My God fulfills covenants. And I think one of the greatest proofs of that, even if you're not Jewish, but is just recognizing objectively that the Jewish people miraculously and remarkably are a people that have somehow not only survived, but have thrived and have done so as a direct result of keeping the exact same covenants that you read, at Bible school or at Sunday school. Jews have actually been doing them and continue to do them. So if you read the Hebrew Bible, which every good member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints should do and does do, when you read the Hebrew Bible and talks about not eating shellfish, there's only one people that continue to do that thing, and that's Judaism. So I know this sounds a little preachy and perhaps elitist or arrogant, but in the same way that I believe that my faith is strengthened through Christianity or through Catholicism, so too I would just assume that if someone is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or someone is a Catholic, or someone is a Protestant, I would just assume that their strength must be strengthened. Excuse me, their faith must be strengthened from the fact that there is a people who, in their Bible, God says, I will make a covenant with you, and those people continue to exist to this day, and they have kept those exact same covenants. You can go to the oldest Torah scroll, which I believe is from the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I believe that is the earliest surviving Torah, although again, someone can fact check me. And the words of Isaiah written on that Qumran Torah scroll are the exact same words of Isaiah that we read in our, synagogue in Los Angeles. It is remarkable how this is the exact same Torah that has not changed in its language, has not changed in its words, the exact same letters, the exact same placement. I mean, that is a remarkable testament to the fact that, as I said, my God does not forsake covenants. My God fulfills covenants.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. If it's any consolation, I also don't eat shellfish. That's mostly because I hate seafood.
Okay.
I will eat freshwater trout if I have caught it and cleaned it and cooked it, but for the most part I don't like to eat meat that has been in water. I just
Okay.
and
We'll,
shellfish is my least favorite. I think shellfish is so gross.
we'll count it. We'll count
um, Thank you. Yeah, I'll say I'm an honorary kosher keeper when it comes to shellfish.
it. All right.
um, but no, I think you're right, and I really appreciate that you bring up that point that God keeps His covenants. You know, a very common saying, I believe it was Dieter F. Uchtdorf who first coined the phrase that you'll hear left and right if you ever set foot inside an LDS church building: doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith. And I think that really applies here because people so often say, oh, well, God promised He would send the Savior. If you're Jewish, He hasn't come yet. If you're Christian, we were expecting His second coming any day. And these people just make me laugh when they say, oh, but is He ever going to come? God swore He was going to do it. He swore He was going to do it. But these things really are in God's timing, not in the timing of man. And I think that what you say there also applies perfectly. He has proven to us throughout all of recorded history that He keeps His promises. He keeps His covenants with us so long as we are keeping our covenants with Him. And I think that's a really, really important note to stress. We talked last time we met, we talked a little bit about epistemology, and I cannot believe in something if I don't have good reason to believe in it. I don't believe in God just because it makes me feel good and, I see a little rainbow in my mind's eye when I picture Him. No, I believe in God because He has proven Himself to me. He has proven Himself to my ancestors. He has earned my trust and He has earned my respect by being there, by keeping His promises. That's how I know that He's always going to keep the promises that He makes. Those promises that have not yet come to fruition, I know that they will because they always have in the past.
Right. That
You know?
actually that reminds me the ending of the tractate, another part of the Talmud called Maseches Makos. Towards the end, there's this interesting story where there are rabbis and they're looking at the Temple Mount and they see the destruction of the temple. And all of a sudden, one of the rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, he starts laughing because he sees foxes emerging from what's called the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept in the temple. And he starts laughing, and all the rabbis, of course, are crying. And they say, how could you possibly be laughing at a moment like this? And he says, because the destruction of the temple is proof that the prophecy is real. And yes, the prophecy prophesied that the temple would be destroyed, but the prophecy also prophesied what? That the temple would be rebuilt and that there would be a redemption that would be fulfilled. So Rabbi Akiva says to the rabbis, when you cry, it's only because you believe in the first part of the prophecy about the pain and the destruction. I'm laughing because when I see the destruction, I simply see that that's just step one. And if step one is true, that means step two is true. And step two is a heck of a lot better. That's the redemption. That's the rebuilding. That's the, eternal glory and bringing God back into this world. So that's kind of what you're saying kind of reminds me of that. And then maybe this is a nice place to close, but I'll close the way I opened, which is I just came back from Israel, and not only was I in Israel, but then I went straight from Israel to Nashville for the inaugural Judeo-Christian Zionist Congress with Patricia Heaton, and it was, really incredible. And they asked me to speak, and I had spoke. I literally came straight from Israel to Nashville without leaving an airport, and I had said, again, irrespective of the state of Israel and Bibi, I just don't understand for the life of me, whether you're Mormon or Catholic, Christian, Jewish, how you cannot go to the land of Israel today and not see biblical prophecy being fulfilled in front of your eyes. In Zechariah, when it talks about that the old will be sitting watching the kids playing in the streets, I mean, you literally see that in Jerusalem, like not as hyperbolic, not as an exaggerate. You literally see it as fact of like all these school kids, playing on the playground, running to school, and, elderly Jerusalemites watching this. It's impossible not to see the words of Isaiah being fulfilled, that, Hebrew will be spoken again. And lo and behold, whether you're at the farmer's market or the doctor's office or walking down the streets, you have an ancient language that has been revitalized. I can't think of forget that historically, I can't think of other people that have come back to their indigenous land and then have spoken the language that their forefathers were speaking, thousands of years earlier. But like the Bible said this would happen. So I just can't for the life of me understand why more Christians, more Jews, more Mormons, more Catholics, more everyone's aren't coming to the land of Israel and just seeing like in front of their eyes, oh my God, I'm opening up Hosea, I'm opening up Isaiah, I'm opening up Zechariah, I'm looking at all the prophets and the things they are writing about as signs of the redemption are almost all happening in front of our very eyes, which is, and with this, I really believe, sorry, I'm going on a tangent, but pre-October 7th, I was always very down on the religious Zionist community. Religious Zionists are Jews who are religious, they're Orthodox Jews just like me, and they believe that the state of Israel is what's called the Reshit Tzmichas Ge'ulasenu, the beginning of the buddings of the redemption. And I was always down on that because I didn't really think it was true. But post October 7th, I have a new profound respect for religious Zionists because it is really, really difficult to deny, as someone who believes in the words of the Bible as being truth, that what is happening in the land of Israel today is just not objective and obvious fulfillment of what was written in the Bible. So again, if you're Catholic, if you're Christian, if you're anyone, I mean, come to the land of Israel and see it for yourself. It's pretty remarkable.
It is. Shabbos, thank you as always. Thank you. I think that's the perfect note to end on.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun, and as I don't know if I always say this, but I should be saying it more often. But it's not lost on me that this is a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous privilege to deepen on a selfish level my relationship and my understanding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As I think I have said to you, and if I haven't, let me say it to you now in public, which is I think Judaism and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints arguably has more in common, both religiously, culturally, and historically, than probably any other religion. And I think it's a shame that there's not yet enough infrastructure to kind of bring those two communities, especially in the United States of America, together. And that's why I'm very, very happy to be doing this podcast with you and your dad, who's not here this week, but maybe next week. So, on that note,
All right. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Okay.